November 2025 will see the world's leading economies converge for the G20 Summit in South Africa. Ahead of this highly anticipated gathering, a powerful and often overlooked voice resonated, that of the global youth. South Africa hosted the G20 Youth Summit, Y20, from the 18th to the 22nd of August, where young leaders from G20 countries and invited guest nations convened to present their vision and policy recommendations. For more, we are joined by Levi Singh, who is a Sherpa from the Y20 South Africa. Levi, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. So the G20 Social Summit will be taking place next week, and it plays quite a pivotal role in integrating civil society voices in the greater G20 decision-making. How significant is this for young people to be adding to that voice?
Well, good evening to you and your viewers, and thank you for having me. This is incredibly significant. It's only the second time ever in the G20's history that a social summit has been hosted. And President Ramaphosa, very early on in his assuming of the South African G20 presidency, had indicated that we will host a G20 social summit to ensure that it is not just the diplomats and technocrats and the financial gurus that are dominating the conversation, but that the citizens of G20 nations are able to ensure that their views and their perspectives are heard as policymakers deliberate towards a final outcome declaration that heads of states will adopt at the end of their heads of state summit. This is incredibly significant for us as South Africa, because this is also the first time that the African Union, which South Africa is a part of, is a full member of the G20. And ultimately, the G20 has such a tremendous power in the geoeconomic space, as it accounts for almost 85% of all global trade. And ultimately, Africa is also home to the world's youngest population, with 60% of the continent's population being under the age of 30, the median age on the African continent being 19 years old, young people making up the largest demographic in the South African context. So this is incredibly important as a moment for young South Africans to really participate in and around the social summit, and to ensure that their voices are heard by policymakers as it pertains to the policy solutions and proposals that will be adopted by G20 heads of states at the end of the Leaders Summit on the 23rd of November.
And what are some of those burning issues that these young delegates would be bringing to the fore, particularly with the recommendations that they would be making pertaining to the social ills that are faced by young people in Africa?
Look, the issues of youth are well documented, and I think given the growing divide between the global north and the global south, there are still shared challenges that really do affect young people across the diversity and divides of the current geoeconomic and geopolitical realm. And one of those major ones being youth unemployment. Young people across the globe are struggling to seek jobs and find jobs successfully. For the longest time, the mantra was go to school, study hard, and you'll eventually end up with a job. That mantra no longer holds true in this new geoeconomic environment that offers very limited economic opportunities for young people. There is, of course, a plethora of other issues, from climate change and the instability of the current climate that young people are growing up in and also creating families in. There's also then the issues around artificial intelligence and some of the emergence of these new technologies that young people actually want policymakers to regulate and to respond to from a policy and legislative perspective. But there has been this latency and hesitancy from policymakers to address some of these issues. And then, of course, there's the historical challenges of poverty and inequality. And young people are saying that they're quite tired of poverty and inequality hitting them the hardest. We've recently seen in weeks and months, from Kenya to Nepal to Sri Lanka to so many other places globally, where Gen Zs in particular have taken to the streets to voice their dissatisfaction with the status quo and to demand change. And ultimately, this is such a pivotal moment, because all of these interconnected issues are coming together in a way that we've never seen before in human history. And young people are demanding political will, political leadership, and accountability at this time of what we term as polycrisis, where all these crises are just coming together in a profound and incredibly detrimental way for young people and their futures.
Levi, I mean, you speak about just those commonalities that exist between young people, both in the global and the north of the global south and the global north of the world. What would you say are the main obstacles that you would find are faced by youth delegates at some of these summits in influencing global governance and those processes, and how would Y20 advise to work through some of those challenges?
I would ask you, how much time do you have for a response to that? But honestly, there has been a significant amount of disagreement within the context of the own summit that we had hosted as the Y20. Ultimately, it was the first time in 15 years where the Y20 had concluded without a communique. And part of this was due to the lack of consensus amongst many of the young people from many of the member states around the institutionalization and mainstreaming of young people in the G20. Many people don't know, but the Y20 is the oldest grouping that young people have pioneered and set up in the context of the G20. It's been in existence since 2010, but ultimately there is no explicit mention of youth issues continually since 2010 in the leaders' declarations. And furthermore, there is no ministerial working groups or mainstreaming approach to youth priorities within the context of the G20. So one of the key issues of disagreement and I'd say contention amongst young people is a G20 and a multilateral system that includes the voices of all young people in their diversity. And as the South African presidency, our clarion call has always been one of radical inclusivity that leaves no young person behind, and a radical inclusivity that ensures that we have a G20, but more importantly, a multilateral architecture from the African Union to the United Nations that work to promote the interests of all young people in their diversity, rather than a privileged elite and exclusive few who find themselves always at the forefront of development with privilege and with an enormous amount of power and influence. So that is one of the big issues of contention that we've had to navigate. But what has been incredibly heartening is young people in the global south, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and on the African continent are banding together, they're building solidarity, and they're working to deepen their coordination to ensure that the voice of this largest generation of young people in human history is adequately heard in the halls of power, from the United Nations to the G20 that will take place in the next week, and that world leaders cannot turn a silent ear to their demands and to their visions of a collective future that is centered on equality, on solidarity, and on sustainability.
Levi Singh, thank you so much for your time. We certainly hope that those voices will be amplified at that summit and translate into the ultimate G20 summit. Thank you so much for your time. That is the Sherpa for Y20 South Africa, Levi Singh.